Welcome to those of you joining us this afternoon for our panel, Is China a Surveillance State? Old and New Tactics of Control. My name is Diana Fu. I'm the director of the East Asia Seminar Series here at the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I am joined today by panelists based in Seoul, based in DC, and also here in Toronto. So we have a very international panel. And I want to say before I introduce the panelists that we very much welcome audience questions, and you can do so by using the Q&A button that is on Zoom, and I will be calling on audience questions. We'll leave at least 20 minutes for Q&A. So without further ado, I want to briefly introduce the panel itself as well as the panelists. So this afternoon's panel is really about China's surveillance. We know that China's surveillance reach is global, and here in Canada, this has been a topic of discussion in particular recently with the police stations being set up abroad and election interference in Canada and spy balloons. So how are we to make sense of China as a surveillance state? So today we're joined by both journalists and researchers for a dynamic discussion of China as a surveillance state. So first we have Josh Chin, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief responsible for politics and general news in the Wall Street Journal's China Bureau. Prior to his current role, Josh spent 6 years as a politics reporter in China covering law, civil society, and the government use of technology. He is a recipient of the Dan Bolas Medal and led an investigative team that won the Gerald Loeb Award for International Reporting in 2018. And of course, he is the co-author of the book with Liza Ling of Surveillance State: Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control, which he will be talking about. We're also joined by Emile Dirks, who is a research associate at the Citizen Lab here at the Munk School. His research on police-led mass biometric surveillance in China has been covered by the New York Times, The Economist, The Intercept, and among other publications. He completed his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto in 2022. And we are also joined by Dahlia Peterson, who is a research analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Her research work focuses on how China harnesses predictive policing algorithms and facial, voice, and gait recognition technologies for AI-powered surveillance programs within its own borders as well as abroad. And at the center, she also studies how China is developing its artificial intelligence, education, and workforce pipelines. And her work has been published by the Brookings Institution, The Diplomat, The Hill, The National Interest, and Routledge. And she's been quoted in numerous media sources. So I hope you join me in warmly welcoming our panelists. And I should mention that Emile Dirks is going to be moderating the panel today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over first to Josh to make some opening statements, and then to Dahlia.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Diana. I'm really thrilled to have the chance to appear here, especially with Dahlia and Emile, who are two people who've done really some of the smartest work on this topic, which is one that I think obviously increasingly matters to people everywhere, not just inside China. I'm also really deeply thankful to Diana for assigning my book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions about it. I'm eager to get to the actual discussion, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. I'll start just by addressing the sort of broader topic of state surveillance, and then zoom in quickly to say a little bit about why it's so critical, I think, to pay attention to what's happening in China. So anyone listening to this today, especially anyone who's published something critical about the Chinese government, especially anyone who has posted a link to that critical content on Twitter, has almost certainly been confronted by replies pointing out that some other government, usually the US government, did the same thing much earlier, and therefore your critiques are meaningless. So I'm not going to launch into a huge takedown of whataboutism here, partly because we really just don't have enough time. But it's also partly because when it comes to Chinese surveillance, the whataboutism is actually right. One of the big revelations that my co-author Lisa and I experienced while doing the research for our book was that state surveillance isn't just widespread; it's basically inseparable from the very notion of a state. Our source for that insight is a book, Seeing Like a State by the political scientist James C. Scott. It's a classic. And it basically argues that rulers can't rule until they render their societies legible. So, if you want to do state-like things like collect taxes or dispense welfare, you need to understand who has money and who doesn't, and how much they have or don't have. And to acquire that knowledge, to make it possible for you to read your populace, you need to collect and analyze data on a mass scale. And you see this in action all the way back to ancient Rome. And of course, as technology has improved, the data collection efforts have grown more ambitious and more sophisticated. In the 20th century, you had Nazi Germany introduce this idea of using data collection not just to read society, but to engineer it. And at the dawn of the 21st century, there was the US coming in and pioneering the use of digital technology to collect and analyze data, huge quantities of personal information on a scale that was previously just unimaginable. So, given all that, why concentrate on China? Why not talk about the US, for example? After all, a lot of the technologies and the techniques that we're going to talk about today that the Chinese government is using were actually invented in the United States. And I would argue that Chinese state surveillance, deserves attention because of the way it combines scale and ambition. So for all the paranoia about what the CIA or the NSA knows about people, China's government has access to more behavioral data than any other government, and it's not even close. The country has around 400 million surveillance cameras, which is about half the global total. It also has 1 billion smartphones, a super app called WeChat that almost everyone in the country uses, and mobile payment systems that record 10 times the transaction volume of MasterCard every year. And the Communist Party has relatively easy access to all of that data, while the US actually doesn't even have a sort of unified national ID card system. The Communist Party in China is also unique in that it has woven all of this digital surveillance into the fabric of its governance model. So in many respects, this is the same utopian vision that the 20th century totalitarians had. But unlike them, the Communist Party has the technology to make that vision plausible. If you read what they write, Communist Party scholars believe that with enough data and the right tools, you can predict behavior and neutralize social problems before they even happen. And you can see this most clearly with the ethnic reengineering efforts in Xinjiang, but it's also evident more recently in the response to COVID-19, when the movements of basically all of China's 1.4 billion people were being tracked around the clock, and everyone was being assigned color-coded risk levels according to their exposure to the virus. So that vision would be sort of unsettling enough if it were limited to China, but of course it's not. It's become a part of the sales pitch for Chinese surveillance companies who've exported state surveillance systems around the globe, including to countries in Western Europe. Those companies and the Communist Party are basically helping normalize this idea that it's okay for governments to use technology to control individuals in ways that are redefining the debate between the balance between security and free will, even in advanced democracies. And meanwhile, places like Canada and the US are only really just beginning to kind of grapple with the need to come up with a democratic approach to those technologies that's capable of competing with China's. So hopefully the conversation today is a productive part of that effort.
Thanks for that opening, Josh. And as you were talking, I was thinking, maybe we should have titled the panel China a distinctive surveillance power, because every state is a surveillance power to some degree or form. And you mentioned that two characteristics that distinguish China from perhaps other surveillance states or powers is A, scale, which you could argue for anything that China does, right? Because it's 1.4 billion people, it's got everybody beat on scale, but also ambition. And I was wondering, Dahlia, and I know this is putting you on the spot a little bit for your opening statement, but given that you research AI and looked into this, what about also its distinctiveness in terms of capability, surveillance capability, its AI capability, as well as its distinctiveness in terms of intention, in terms of what the Chinese state intends to do with the data? I mean, Josh, you cover some of the stuff that they have done with the data and in story form and very vivid form. But I was wondering, Dahlia, if you could build upon this a little bit more and tell us about what do you see that is distinctive about China as a surveillance state.
Absolutely. And I would like to echo the thanks. Very grateful to be here with this distinguished panel. So I'm happy to ping off of what Josh was mentioning with the scale of the surveillance state. Indeed, China's surveillance state is the largest and most comprehensive in terms of not only the number of surveillance cameras used, but also the different suite of technologies that they use, and also the number and the scope of the national surveillance programs that they have in operation by Chinese government agencies. So what I'll touch upon today is both some of the domestic side of what China's doing, as well as a little bit of what it's doing abroad. And then when we get to the Q&A and the discussion later, I'd be happy to talk more about how democracies can really start thinking about how to design these alternatives that Josh was alluding to. So in terms of what China's doing that really sets it apart, as I mentioned with the national programs, they have several of these that have been in operation, some of them since the early 2000s or even before. And so some of the more modern examples that I would touch upon include Skynet. This is a national surveillance program that really focuses on public areas. There's also Sharp Eyes, which is a little bit more recent. And that one is really trying to bring rural and urban surveillance together. And because rural areas in China have traditionally not had a sufficient police presence, they really rely on citizen policing to they directly bring them in to help perform surveillance on each other. And then that's also married with some pretty cutting edge technology. Another example I'll mention is Police Cloud. That is one that's based on predictive policing, and that is like merging provincial cloud computing centers. And that is done on a scale that I haven't seen replicated in other countries as well. So where I would say that China is really setting itself apart here is the degree to which it's using something called data fusion. So that is essentially when you're merging data sources from a bunch of different sources, such as facial recognition, such as Wi-Fi, GPS, and other sources of data. And the goal there is to really be able to pinpoint individuals as they're going about different activities and really form a complete picture about their lives, not only what they have been doing, but what they might go on to do as well. So there's a bit more of the predictive element in that. So that's something that I have not seen done in other countries. That's really where China is distinct.
I'll just sorry to interrupt, but this is really fascinating. I think for our audience who may not have a concrete idea of how that works, could you just give an example of what data fusion would look like as, say you were being surveilled in China? What would this technology be able to predict about your life? Yeah.
Sure. So say like you're going about your day, you're driving in your car, and your license plate is scanned by a license plate recognition reader. And so they're able to see which points you're crossing in any part where there is a license plate recognition reader, based on where your cell phone, as you have your cell phone with you, it's pinging off of cell towers. It's also able to pinpoint locations whether you're in your car or not, it's still able to follow you based on your physical trajectory, and then facial recognition cameras that are placed in public areas as they are widespread across China would also be able to recognize who you are as an individual. There are also certain programs that are able to correlate who you are associating with. So that's something more in the realm of programs like Police Cloud. So they're not only able to see where you're going, but who you're associating with, and then also able to tie that with the traffic that is coming out of your phone. So like what websites you're visiting, and when, and the content that you post. So it's really just a very comprehensive picture of who you are in a way that is that's a pretty difficult process to do, and China is aware that it has limitations in how far that can go, and there are some certain hurdles to that operating perfectly. So I do not want to overstate that like how perfectly that operates. There are hurdles to that, but the scope to which China is doing that far exceeds any other country that I have seen. So, I mean, in the interest of time, I'm happy to just move into the Q&A, or I can talk about the international element. Either one is fine.
I think you should talk a little bit about the international element.
Sure. So then on the international side, there's a bit more of that's where the exports really come into play. And it's not just exports of technology, but it's also, in a sense, there's the de facto exports through China's setting of surveillance standards, through international standards development organizations. So this includes technologies such as facial recognition. And here China is really trying to mirror its approach through China Standards 2035. They're really trying to take what they are developing in terms of domestic technology standards and, to as much as they can, bring that to the international standards development organizations as well. And so that is not something that they are always experiencing success in, and those bodies are pretty resilient overall to resisting any Chinese influence, but there are certain bodies that are a little bit more vulnerable to that. And so I think that is an area that deserves more careful attention to see where and if and how Chinese influence is occurring at standards development bodies. But more on the technology export side, there are at least 80 countries, including across democracies, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian regimes that have adopted these technologies. And there is also evidence of data fusion being used because they are using these comprehensive technology platforms. So those have already been used to monitor dissidents and those who are not friendly to regimes in more hybrid or autocratic regimes. And so there's already the proven risk that there is democratic backsliding that can be assisted by these technologies. So there is a major risk that this can continue if these technologies continue proliferating. So I'll pause here. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Those are very dense. You've given us a lot to chew on, both of you. So I'm going to hand it over to Emile now, who will moderate the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, this is fantastic, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I've learned a lot from both of your work. What I'd like to kind of pick up on first as a question is, Josh, you're mentioning kind of maybe what's unique about the Chinese surveillance state is kind of the scope and the ambition. And Dahlia, you talked about kind of the fusion of various forms of data that are being collected. And I think sometimes, even for myself, doing this kind of work, looking at the Chinese surveillance state, there's sometimes a tendency, or understandable, to assume that it works as well as advertised, right? Whether in the words of the Chinese state itself or in the words of Chinese state critics. But I was wondering, based on the work that both of you have done, how well do you think Chinese surveillance state practices work in reality? Right? Is it basically operating at the level that we might assume it is, or is there a bit of a gap between how it's described and how it actually functions in practice? Whoever wants to take a stab at it first, please go ahead.
Dahlia, do you want to take a first swing?
Sure. Thank you, Josh. So yeah, I would say that I alluded to this a little bit in that data fusion doesn't work perfectly. One of the major things that underlies this is a long ongoing issue that China has been aware of, is something called data islands. Josh talks about it in his book with Liza as well. This is something that is not only technological, but is also bureaucratic in nature. So there is certain stovepiping of data where it's not necessarily shared between the agencies that need that data. It can be siloed in certain aspects. And so this is something that since like the 2000s or even earlier, Chinese agencies such as the Ministry of Public Security have often talked about data islands as something that they're trying to overcome. And so this plus, I would say, like human error. So there's often one of my most admired surveillance scholars, Maya Wong, she's called it the bumbling police state, right? So there's certain things where police officers, as they're going around, they input things wrong into the system, or they use inconsistent data formatting. And this can actually, when you then blow it up across millions of people, that can lead to a lot of hindrances in how effectively you are able to process that data. So China does have the most advanced surveillance technologies. And as Josh said, many of those technologies are directly enabled and empowered by US and other Western technology companies. But in terms of in practice, there are certain bureaucratic hurdles that actually do pose quite significant problems. And China is well aware of them, and they are actively trying to address it.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I would just I think it might be helpful to think of it in terms of this question in terms of an on the ground example. And I think the most obvious one is Xinjiang. And I think when you look at Xinjiang, what becomes clear when you're trying to answer this question is what do you mean by work, right? Like when you ask whether the surveillance works, right? And I think, if you look at what China's doing with the Uyghurs, their most ambitious aim there is to track and categorize Uyghurs and use data to sort of sift out individuals in Xinjiang who pose the most risk, basically to the Communist Party's sort of preferred order, and then to ship those people off to camps or prisons to sort of remold them, and ultimately to sort of remold Uyghur identity in and of itself, right? So that the Uyghurs sort of start to see themselves as more Chinese than not, right? And obviously that's a really long process. But so far, at least, it seems to have had the opposite effect. It seems to have galvanized Uyghur identity in a lot of instances, and to have really sort of increased the distance between Uyghurs and the rest of the Chinese state. But it also has a sort of more basic aim, and that's just to crush Uyghur resistance, right? To sort of crush the ability of Uyghurs to disrupt the Communist Party in Xinjiang. And in that respect, it's actually been very successful, right? It's just as far as we can tell. I mean, it's really difficult now as a journalist to move around Xinjiang, but as far as we know, there have not been any major protests or major attacks against the Chinese state since the system was put in place, and you can see why when you go there, right? It's just impossible to really organize anything or do anything if you're a Uyghur in Xinjiang. So I think if you zoom out, as Dahlia said, yes, the surveillance system does have a lot of blind spots, even in Xinjiang, actually. I mean, it was, when I was there, it was possible to find places where you could talk to Uyghurs and not be observed, right? But in some ways, I think there's a question of whether it matters, right? And I think from a raw control point of view, I think what ultimately matters is that people think they're being watched. And in China, you see that. I mean, the surveillance is as much a sort of propaganda project as it is a technological project. The state media likes to talk about surveillance a lot. They don't hide it. And I think the reason is they want to create this notion that they are all seeing, and that's not true, of course, but I think a lot of people in China increasingly believe that it is, which is quite effective.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on that point, talking about the impacts of surveillance on communities within China. I was wondering actually from both of you, what do you get the sense of how ordinary Chinese people understand the surveillance state or understand their own place within the state or the way in which the state monitors them? And more broadly, maybe what do they have a sense of a right to personal privacy as something that is owed to them, either right to privacy from private actors or right to privacy from the state itself? Maybe I'll start with Josh because you had brought this up, and then pass it over to Dahlia.
Yeah, sure. That's a really, really fascinating question, especially the Chinese attitudes towards privacy. I mean, I think this is something that anyone who looks at this immediately starts to think about. And what's particularly fascinating about it is how dynamic the situation is, and how quickly it's been changing over the years. I mean, when we started, when Lisa and I started doing the reporting that led to this book, which is back in 2017, I think if most people you talk to in China, they didn't really think about surveillance much, right? And if you did put it to them, you're being watched all the time and your data is being collected, they were just like, whatever. If you're not doing anything wrong, what do you have to worry about? Which actually turns out to be a very common attitude globally, not just in China. But we started doing the research, and we realized that the word for privacy in Mandarin, 隐私, did not appear in the official Chinese dictionary until 1998. Right. So it was just it existed as an idea, especially in sort of wealthier pockets in China, but people weren't really talking about it in a serious way. And I think that's changed over time, quite a bit, especially at least in cities, and to the point where now you do have quite a robust discussion of privacy. And now the sort of the conversation is privacy from defending privacy against whom, right? And I think there's like a sort of universal sense in China now that companies are bad, and that they're collecting your data for potentially nefarious purposes, and that they're leaking it to scammers and that sort of thing. But increasingly, the government is starting to, I think, have to face a little bit of this skepticism, and that's partly because of the coronavirus pandemic and the way zero COVID was rolled out, which I know we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But anyway, it's a very, I think the point is it's a very fluid situation in China now, and it's hard to say actually what Chinese people in general think about surveillance. I think their attitudes are evolving.
Yeah, I think Josh raises several excellent points, and that's something I want to echo as well. It's really difficult to generalize across that many people, but I would say, generally speaking, that the whole zero COVID protests with the whole blank pieces of paper and things like that really posed a more recent shift in individuals perhaps being more aware of the extent of state surveillance. But I would also say that Chinese individuals, and partly I would say that this is due to the somewhat successful narratives that Chinese state-run media has had in the way that they describe these national surveillance programs. They really do they overhype it a lot in terms of how widespread it is, how accurate and how fast it is, but also in the sense of how much it protects people's basic needs. So I've seen Ministry of Public Security propaganda, essentially, that has been talking about how programs like Sharp Eyes, written for more rural audiences, saying that this really decreased theft and kidnapping, and they even use this like really, to us it might seem odd, but in the sense of to a rural audience, a very apt example of how farmers were no longer losing their sheep to theft because of programs like Sharp Eyes. And so when it directly connects to your livelihood and your sense of basic security, which is not something that is guaranteed across China, that is something that can fairly effectively convince people that if they are not necessarily doing anything wrong, that they are they have nothing to fear. But I think that perspective I just said is something that is very widespread across all countries, and you've seen it used a lot in democracies like the US as well, in the sense of, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have nothing to hide. So that is definitely not something unique to China. And the last thing I would say on this is that partly also because of narrative shaped by the state media in China, that there's a lot more of a focus on privacy violations by the private sector in China. So a lot more of the laws are targeting violations of like a data abuse in China, and the laws that have been passed have been, it seems, quite intentionally designed to target and put private companies on the spot for this, while pretty much leaving the actual, public security organs to no scrutiny at all. So there's a bit of that divide in China where they are used as a cover for the real architecture of the surveillance state.
Yeah, this is a topic that I find very fascinating. And I think, as both of you mentioned, it seems to me that the relationship of individuals with state surveillance is one that probably is best understood in a comparative sense, actually looking at the way that Americans, Canadians, as well as Chinese and others view their relationship to forms of state surveillance, state observation. Both of you mentioned COVID, the pandemic, as well as the protest movement that evolved last year in response to some of the harsh lockdown measures. So I'd like to actually ask about the pandemic control measures. So clearly it seems that one of the biggest surveillance programs in certainly recent history in China was related to pandemic controls. We've seen local and provincial authorities across China built up massive forms of social control as a way to stem the spread of the coronavirus. But with the end of COVID-0, my question is, have these systems been absorbed into other existing state surveillance programs, or have they been abandoned along with COVID-0? So maybe I'll start with Dahlia first, and then move on to Josh.
I'm happy for Josh to take this question. I'll add anything on top of that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, definitely happy to take that on. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal and I have been paying attention to and looking for a way to write about. I mean, I think this is, it really is remarkable what happened with COVID, and the seeing essentially a lot of the same systems that were pioneered in Xinjiang being rolled out nationwide in terms of tracking people 24 hours a day, and sort of controlling their movements and rating them according to risk levels and that sort of thing. And I think it's actually sort of a testament to this sort of increasing privacy consciousness that we were just talking about, that the government has really made a lot of its efforts to dismantle this. Since COVID-0 sort of abruptly ended after the protests in December, they were actually remarkably fast to take the health code systems offline, right? These were the systems where you had to scan QR codes everywhere you went. And if you had a green code, you were fine. If you had a red or yellow code, you maybe had to go to quarantine. That has essentially been dismantled nationwide, or has been taken offline rather. And then actually just earlier this month, the city of Wuxi made a big deal of destroying its health data collected during the pandemic, or at least a portion of it. I think there are some pretty profound reasons for skepticism, obviously, around that. I mean, for one, data deleted in one place doesn't mean it's deleted everywhere. And the infrastructure that they built up to track everyone for COVID was immense. And I don't think we haven't seen any signs that they've actually dismantled the background infrastructure itself, right? And just as a principle, governments don't usually give up these sort of systems willingly, right? And there really isn't any force in China compelling the Communist Party to give up these systems. So they're not they're not actively using them right now, but as I think it's a reasonable assumption at this point that the system still exists and could be repurposed if they needed to be.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Josh. There was a lot of reporting that came out that said that it was just such an about face, prompted a lot of scrutiny why China just suddenly decided to end zero COVID, and the really quite incredible shutdown of these systems and the total abandonment of them. I remember when this first came out in 2020, a lot of the concern that I had on this was that there were no mentions whatsoever of any sunset clauses in any of these. Then this was something that was a concern beyond China as well. But given that there were no sunset clauses built into any of these discussions around COVID surveillance in China and how widespread it was, I would say that China does indeed have a very high incentive to factor these technologies into and build it into a trend of surveillance creep. So I would say that even if those systems have shut down, we may not have seen the last of it yet. And as we were discussing earlier, they are using this as a justification and kind of like an advertisement for their capabilities when they're exporting these technologies abroad. So I wouldn't say that it's just completely gone underground and that we're never going to see anything from it again.
Well, picking up on that last point about exporting abroad, as well as maybe the uniqueness or the unique severity of the lockdown measures that were put in place in China, as well as the measures that were put in place in Xinjiang that Josh was talking about. Just as the last question before we get on to audience Q&A, I was wondering if you look at the China, if there is a China model, if we can speak of a China model of state surveillance, is this a model that is exportable, right? Is that like we talk about the exporting of, say, particular technical components, but is this model of, say, data fusion or the scale or the ambition, is this something that other countries could possibly take on themselves? Or again, if there is a Chinese model of state surveillance, is it also one that really only works within the context of Chinese society, within the context of China's particular authoritarian political system? Maybe I'll start with Josh.
Yeah, no, that is, I mean, that's another question that comes up over and over again when you talk about Chinese state surveillance, and it's you know, for good reason. I think the short answer is no, but with caveats, right? And I'll sort of explain that a little bit. I mean, when we were, you know, you look at China and what China's done, and how it's rolled out surveillance system, it has a lot of unique advantages. And this is, you know, I mean, this sort of extends to China's growth model in general, right? But it's an immense country with a lot of resources, and obviously access to extremely advanced technology and a immense and relatively professional and capable bureaucracy, right? Plus a population that's willing to, for the most part, to sort of accept a certain level of state surveillance. And those are conditions that do not exist in most countries, or maybe in any other country. So it's interesting because, you know, China certainly uses the model as a sales tactic for these systems abroad, and we saw this in Africa. We went to Uganda, where Huawei sold a sort of, you know, state surveillance starter kit to Yoweri Museveni, the leader there, who probably used it to start tracking opposition politicians, right? And so we were looking at how they did it in Africa and in other countries, in Uganda and other countries in Africa, and you know, the government was very heavily involved in making that sale. They brought Ugandan police to Beijing, to the Ministry of Public Security's building on Tiananmen Square, right off Tiananmen Square, and ran them through how they do everything. And that was, you know, I think key to making that sale, right? That vision that they conjured, I think really captured the imagination of the Ugandan police. And effective, on the ground, of course, you got to, its systems don't work nearly as well as Chinese systems, and even when you account for sort of all the flaws and blind spots that we've been talking about. And we also talked to a consultant whose job was to help governments in the developing world install these systems and manage these sorts of systems. And he was talking about how, he was sitting in a control room in one country, one African country, where it was being run by traffic police, and he watched as the operator used the camera to spy on another member of the traffic police accepting a bribe, and then called the guy and demanded, half of that bribe. Right. So he was essentially using it to surveil the other traffic police. So I think there's, there are a lot of barriers to other countries implementing this kind of a system in the way that China does. Although I would say that I don't think it's necessarily China's aim to replicate its model around the globe. In fact, if you look at what China says about its own model, it says it's exceptional, right? It talks about China as being the special case. Right. But what they do want is for it to be okay for governments to use this technology in whatever way they want. Right. And this sort of mirrors the way they talk about the internet, for example, and internet censorship and internet sovereignty is the way they talk about it. Right. That every government should be allowed to manage the internet the way they see fit. Right. And I think their approach with surveillance technology is the same. Right. They don't care how you use it. They just care that it's okay for people to use it to control societies if they want to.
Yeah, those are some really excellent points. I would say that it's not necessarily really possible to export it in that exact replica sense, because there is not the same degree of infrastructure, and there's also just not the same scale of because there is no other country out there that has the same degree and count of national surveillance programs. So they are often done in the safe cities context. So they are comprehensive technology platforms that are using technologies from both Chinese and Western companies alike, but it's not plugged into the same system and that is connected to the Ministry of Public Security and all the public security bureaus across China. It is just not, there's no context for that to be done in a similar way in countries that are adopting surveillance technology. And this is especially not possible in countries that are more democratic, because they have robust civil society presence that is able to push back on this, and also the presence of legal safeguards. I would say that there's a good example from France where Huawei was not able to enable the facial recognition capabilities in its cameras because there is a law that does not allow for the use of facial recognition unless permitted in public spaces. So that technology was not able to be used in its full and intended capacity. So I would say overall, I would agree with Josh. It's not necessarily China's intent explicitly, but to the extent that they are trying to have this go in a more broad global scale, I would again turn to standards as one of the ways in which they are trying to put a bit more of their footprint in how they view the technology and how it should potentially be used, and putting that approach more out there in terms of how it is standardized.
Great. Well, we're going to turn to some audience questions now, and I would encourage those of you still online with us to keep posing these questions. So I'm going to definitely play favorites and ask the first question from one of my own students at the Munk School of Global Affairs. So the student, I think, asks a very good comparative question about the US and about China. She asks, we've talked a lot about this distinctiveness of China's surveillance state and how comprehensive it is compared to other states. However, Snowden's whistleblowing highlighted that the American government also collects a lot of data behind the scenes. So do you think the US may have just as comprehensive of a surveillance system as China's, but just doesn't get as much bad publicity, I would say, about it? So I want to direct this, I guess, first to Josh.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. As we talked about the fact that actually, a lot of the technologies and the sort of the modern sort of digital surveillance industry began in the United States. It sort of began with the Patriot Act in some ways after 9/11. And then with the rise of the internet giants like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Silicon Valley. I mean, those companies pioneered the entire field of sort of big data behavioral analytics, right? So and certainly as the Snowden revelations showed, the U.S. government is very interested in collecting lots of information, and I think what it comes down to is every government is interested in doing that. In the U.S., I mean, I don't think its surveillance capabilities are nearly as comprehensive as China's, and that's as Dahlia pointed out, that's partly because there are a lot of legal barriers to that, and sort of there's civil society to sort of keep watch and make sure that doesn't happen. What I will say though is that a lot of the same techniques, technologies, the use of facial recognition by police, the use of predictive policing exists in the US very much so. And police departments especially in New York, other large cities, are very interested in experimenting with them. And it makes sense, right? Because it makes their jobs easier, right? If you're a policeman trying to find a criminal suspect, it's just a lot easier to turn on cameras that have facial recognition than it is to go through video footage by hand and compare it to a bunch of mugshots, right? So it's in the U.S. And governments local governments and federal agencies in the U.S. want to use it. I think one major barrier is that at least in the United States, is the identification system, because in the U.S. Most people are identified through their driver's licenses, which are state agencies. There's departments of motor vehicles kind of around the states, and not all of those agencies are willing to share their databases with federal agencies like the FBI, for example. So there's barriers there that China doesn't face. And then legally, I think there are various efforts in various cities to ban facial recognition, for example. But I think in the end, the difference is going to come down to whether people in places like the United States or Canada, democracies, really take it seriously and make sure those barriers stay up and are being used effectively, because there's a lot of wiggle room.
Right. So instead of turning to Dahlia on this particular question, I want to turn to another question. I think this one is for Dahlia, really. Could you please expand on what you talked about with China, not only exporting its surveillance technology, but also trying to influence international bodies in terms of norm setting standards. So what kind of standards are they trying to get these international bodies to set, and what does China benefit? How does China benefit from those standards being changed or molded to look more like China's own standards?
Right. So I would say that there's both geopolitical benefits, and then there's also massive commercial benefits that come from setting these standards and being the forerunner in this. So I'll talk about the commercial ones first. If you're able to be the one who is leading on this and setting the standard that countries across the world then choose to adopt. Again, I want to emphasize this is voluntary in terms of the adoption. There's nothing that you have to adopt these standards that are set, but those companies that are able to have standards set for emerging technologies, they are able to claim royalties on what are considered standards essential technologies. And so they are able to reap massive benefits from that if they're ahead on the curve on that. In terms of the geopolitical side of things, this is going back to China's Standards 2035 plan, again, where they are trying to bring their domestic footprint. And I think they have a quota set or a goal set of bringing about 85% of the domestic standards that they are setting to international standards bodies. And other scholars who have been looking at this have said that that's not necessarily something that China is actually going to be able to successfully do. But to the extent that they can implement their viewpoint of how these technologies should be used, in certain cases, like with facial recognition, they were kind of blurring the lines in terms of just purely technical standards, because they were saying this is where you should use these technologies. You should compare it to the fugitive library and use it to find hiding criminals and things like that. And this is the type of data that you should be looking for in terms of facial attributes, and this is how you should store it. So things like that, in terms of their approaches, to the extent that they can get developing countries who don't really have their own resources to develop these standards themselves to adopt those technologies, they're able to, in a sense, spread their approach to how these technologies should be used to other countries.
So just a quick follow-up on that. So using these technologies to find criminals doesn't seem so, insidious. So can you give us just one example of a norm setting that you do feel like would be, against democratic norms that China is really, really pushing on?
Sure. So even if it says that it is to find criminals, the issue with that is that that is a term that can be used extremely broadly, and it can be up to interpretation by who is adopting those technologies and who is in power. So that can very easily be defined as someone who is challenging the person in power. So I think Josh was talking about the whole example with Ghana, and I think that is a good example. That's not directly, I'm not drawing a direct line to standards there, but I'm saying that is a good example of an approach of where he was essentially defined, the dissident was defined as someone who, is threatening the person in power. And so they're going to use all the technologies at their disposal to monitor him and to get ahead on what he's planning so that he does not unseat the person who is in power. So criminals is not something that is uniformly defined in countries, and then that's really subject to interpretation.
Right. Criminals can mean theft. It can also mean political dissidents, right? So I want to turn the question a little bit, or stay on the external aspect of this. We're going to combine two questions. One question has to do with how extensive visual data collection is by the Chinese government outside of China. And then relatedly, sort of the flip side of it, which is a question posed by someone who I assume is interested in social change and activism, which I'll pitch to either Emile or Josh, is how can activists or people who are concerned about this really battle, or what steps should be taken? Like you mentioned civil society organizations, but what about ordinary people? So let me maybe pitch we can either start with that question, or maybe Dahlia wants to talk about the visual data collection, or Josh, you can talk about that too. Maybe first talk about how extensive is visual data collection by the Chinese government outside of China, and then how can people address this? So maybe Josh first. Yeah.
Sure. On the visual data collection outside of China, Dahlia may have more to say on this than I do. I think it's a little bit hard to answer. I mean, there's certainly Chinese-made cameras everywhere around the world. The two largest surveillance camera makers in the world, they're Hikvision and Dahlia, are both based in China. Actually, both based in the same city in China, in Hangzhou, and they account for most of the new surveillance cameras that are being installed around the world. And there's concern, probably not unjustified, that a lot of those cameras could have backdoors, and that those companies could be collecting visual data on behalf of the Chinese government. Certainly plausible. It's hard to find evidence of that happening. One example we know of that's somewhat interesting is a Chinese facial recognition startup at one point tried to go to Zimbabwe to set up facial recognition systems there and build a facial recognition database, because one of the problems with facial recognition is that it's only as good as the data you feed into it, right? And so Chinese systems are fed mostly Chinese faces, so they're really bad at recognizing non-Chinese faces, or non-Uyghur faces anyway. And so they were trying to collect black faces basically to improve their algorithm, and they were quite open about it. And I went to Zimbabwe not too long after that, and at the time that there was a huge uproar over it, and actually the program had sort of run into a bit of a brick wall because people didn't appreciate being used in that way. So a bit of an unsatisfying answer, I'm afraid, but I don't think we have a ton of visibility into it.
Yeah, I would say the same. This is a question that a lot of people want to have the concrete answer to. A lot of the time, the classic example that is brought up is the CloudWalk Zimbabwe example. But one thing that I always find quite curious is the very high performance of Chinese facial recognition startups such as Megvii and CloudWalk, and then also, giants like Hikvision and Dahlia. How they perform extraordinarily well. They often top the leaderboards in the US's, one of the Department of Commerce's bodies, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They run a facial recognition vendor test every year. And so they have scenarios where you are doing live surveillance, and they consistently top the leaderboards in that. And so the question is, where are they obtaining their training data sets from? That is not something that there are often open source data sets that are used to train facial recognition systems, and yet we still have this very persistent problem that is gradually improving in terms of the disparities in how well these systems work on different racial groups and different genders. And so this is a question that we don't have visibility into how these companies are training their data sets. So one can only wonder how their performance is so outstanding compared to other companies.
I mean, doesn't the US also have companies that are exporting its surveillance technologies as well, including all sorts of AI technologies? And how does that figure into all of this? Because we often cast China as the, oh, it's the big boogeyman that's, not only surveillance its own population, but also doing so abroad. But the US has that too, right? And there's in some competition with Chinese companies. So how did we make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it was interesting in Uganda when Huawei was pitching its systems there. They were actually bidding against a Canadian company at the time, right? And so and that is true. I mean, there are German companies, Israeli companies, American companies, Canadian, all sort of competing in this space. I think China is unique in the sense that the scale of its companies are immense. Like we just said, they have the biggest companies, right? And so that makes them more affordable. And I think that's kind of partly what it comes down to, is the Chinese systems are a little bit cheaper. China's government is willing to help with financing. And then China's government is also very involved in sort of bringing people over for training and sort of selling these systems as a system rather than just as individual technologies.
Yeah, I would add to that on top of US and Canadian companies that have been the backbone of, ever since with the Golden Shield project, you have Western companies who have been essential elements of this. Even when you don't look at the whole technology, like that they're not necessarily selling facial recognition systems. In addition to that, the fact that their underlying hardware is essential to the operation of these surveillance systems, I think is really key. And the Financial Times just came out with a story on this, on how companies that have been placed on the US entity list that should not be accessing US originating technology are doing this through loopholes by renting access through cloud providers. So they are still able to access NVIDIA chips, for example, and then they are renting that access out to companies that are subject to US export controls. And this is a huge loophole in the US export control system. And so I would like that you cannot divorce China's operation of its surveillance state, both domestically and abroad, from the fact that they are very much enabled by companies in the US to operate those systems, because they do not have their own alternatives to do that themselves.
Fascinating. So I would be amiss if I didn't ask a question about what is on everybody's minds right now, which is the big story in Canada about China's election interference, or I should say the Chinese government's election interference. So, and I realize you both are not, based in Canada, but is there anything, and Emile, feel free to chime in as well. How do we make sense of China's surveillance capacity and technology, and how that ties in with its ability or capability to interfere with elections abroad?
Happy to defer to the Canadian in this panel.
You don't have to say anything mind-blowing, Emile, but
Well, I think I'm like many people still trying to make sense of all the revelations that come out. I think just maybe tying it back to the issue of surveillance and to who tends to be targeted by for these programs, I think it's probably good to keep in mind that as many people within the Chinese or Tibetan or Uyghur, Hong Kong diaspora pointed out, they're often the ones who are at the receiving end of state repression, whether within their territories or here in Canada or elsewhere. So I think oftentimes it's good to sometimes center our analysis or our investigation into these programs around the experience and the analysis of people who are themselves victimized by these programs. And I would say the same thing to the question that was asked earlier about, what should be done, whether in our communities or globally, about these surveillance programs. I think, a good place to begin is just to take a very principled kind of concern about how these programs are used against a diverse range of people, whether they resemble us or don't, even including criminalized populations, users of drugs, or people with mental health issues, as well as dissidents and religious minorities and others. I think it's often a good place to start. And we should do that on principle, because these are other human beings who are deserving of respect and fair treatment under the law. And we should also do it because these programs have a tendency to metastasize. If they're accepted in one area, they tend to grow in other areas. And we've seen this in China, but we've also seen this in the United States, Canada, and other places. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Surveillance creep and what we should do about it. Well, I wanted to thank again. This has been such a sobering, but and also an exciting conversation with Josh, Dahlia, and Emile. And thank you all for joining us again. I want to remind you we have an upcoming EAS seminar at the end of March, on this time talking about China's maritime laws. So please join us for that. Thank you very much once again, and thank you to the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Have a great afternoon, everyone.